Right, well, good afternoon, comrades. Welcome to another Sunday Win meeting. This week's Roger's going to lead off on Britain. Britain's becoming increasingly chaotic from being the world leader in the British Empire and the massive empire it had. It's now crumbling into chaos with all sorts of things like no petrol, empty petrol states, shells, the monarchies on very rocky grounds. So we're looking at going from sort of a leading state to being a failed state, really. So Roger's going to lead off for about 30 minutes, and then I'll take contributions of 5 minutes or so. Before we start, could you all just make sure you're muted, because if you're not and you make a noise in your room, it does disrupt the meeting. So if you're not muted, could you mute yourself now? Yeah. Okay. Right. All right. Over to Roger.
Right, okay, comrades. Well, as Pam said, you take a glance at Britain today and what we see is poverty, gridlock, an atmosphere of imminent catastrophe. Gordon Brown, Chris Patten, George Osborne have all in the last few days raised the same spectre. Is Britain at risk of becoming a failed state? Now, let's put that in context, of course. 19th century Britain was the world's richest and most advanced economy, the world's first modern industrialized nation. Napoleon called Britain the workshop of the world. Its finished goods were produced so efficiently and cheaply that they could often undersell comparable locally manufactured goods in almost any other market. One businessman wrote in 1826, "The prospects which are now opening to England almost exceed the boundaries of thought and can be measured by no standard found in history." Of course, Marx and Engels based their analysis of capitalism on their study of Britain, because it was the birthplace of industrial production and still the preeminent case study of capitalism, the laboratory in which they could examine the laws of capitalism and the growth of the working class. An industrial working class was emerging as a political force in its own right, in the form of the Chartists who mobilized millions of workers. It was under the direct influence, of course, of Marx and Engels, who were by then based in Britain, that the London Trades Council formed the bedrock of the world's first Workers' International. So much for the myth of the British way of compromise. So the UK's share of manufacturing output when that man I quoted was speaking in 1830 was 9.5%. It reached its peak at 22.9% in the 1870s, with about 1/4 of world production. And then the decline began from 1880 onwards with the rise of Germany and simultaneously the USA. And 100 years later, it had shrunk by 1973 to 4.9%. Its empire had become a curse and a drain and a disincentive to invest and modernize, while America and Europe were building modern industrial plants. Britain had vainly relied on shrinking imperial preferences, and it failed to compete with its rivals' industrial investment and development. It was left with a massive and powerful working class, the heirs of the traditions of Peterloo, the Chartists, and the founding members of the First International, but it was outclassed and outsold in world manufacture and trade. So then, of course, came 2 world wars and the collapse of the British Empire. Britain's role was superseded by the USA, and that began a long decline comparable to that of Spain. If you look at Spain, its empire had crumbled over the 19th century, was similarly usurped by the rising power of the USA, and over decades it was left with recurrent wars, coups, a rotting dynasty, and of course, in Spain's case, ultimately civil war and fascism. Now, in the 1960s and 1970s, British industry was increasingly reliant upon state subsidies to keep its flagging industries alive. And the main political debate at that time was on whether to continue supporting, the phrase was lame ducks, or to let the failing industries collapse and go to the wall. Now, I remember when I first joined Militant in 1964, at meeting after meeting, I heard Ted Grant explain that the complaint of the British ruling class was that British industry was overmanned, that there were 5 million redundant workers in the British factories, but that they didn't dare provoke uproar by sacking them. Anyway, a Labour government was narrowly elected in 1964, promising a revitalisation, as Wilson put it, the white heat of technology, hoping to catch up and to compete with its new arrivals. This ended, of course, with the devaluation of the pound. And alarmed by the uprising in France in 1968 and the worldwide wave of radicalisation, and taking their cue from the colonel's coup in Greece, which had happened in 1967, there was one faction of the ruling class who were already actively contemplating a military coup in Britain. It involved the newspaper magnate Cecil Harmsworth King, who was the Rupert Murdoch of his day, and he was also, by the way, an MI5 agent, and Earl Mountbatten, who was both Prince Philip's uncle and a second cousin of the Queen. Now, King was allowed to explain his proposals to a meeting of young officers at Sandhurst. There were conspiratorial meetings at the Defence Ministry. Up to 30 MI5 officers were known to be involved in the plot. And the plans even went so far as to designate the Shetland Isles as the site for an internment camp for the likes of us. Now, the Times, which was edited by William Rees-Mogg, father of our friend Jacob, in an editorial entitled The Danger to Britain, encouraged the notion of a coup to depose Wilson's government in favour of what he called a government of business leaders. Then, anyway, it didn't come to that. It came to the Tory election victory in 1970. And the government tried in vain to curb the power of the trade unions, but it soon collapsed in a humiliating defeat for the ruling class. Heath, the Prime Minister, Heath, swerved quickly into a U-turn. The commonplace assumption at the time was that the unions were too powerful, that they, quote, ran the country. This was the time of the closure by mass pickets of the Talkley Coke Depot during the 1972 miners' strike, when 5 leading shop stewards on the East London docks were jailed and the CUC threatened a general strike, and the government had to magic up an obscure functionary called the official solicitor to find a loophole to release them. Pickets were jailed during the National Building Workers' strike. There was a second National Coal Miners' strike in 1974, leading to the imposition of a 3-day working week. It was really a virtual natural general lockout. Britain was completely paralysed. Heath was forced to gamble on the declaration of an early general election, which he fought on the slogan, "Who runs Britain, the government or the trade unions?" And he received an unmistakable answer, one that he didn't like. Labour won the election. So a Labour government came to power. The miners won their full claim. And with Michael Foot as Minister of Labour, trade union rights were hastily restored. And the second Wilson and then Callaghan government began by introducing some reforms. But from the beginning, it was rocked by economic crisis, runaway inflation, strikes, industrial unrest, and a wave of terrorist bombings. So during its period of office, retired generals were literally forming private armies. Military manoeuvres were even staged at Heathrow Airport as an overt warning. Contingency plans were again being openly discussed for a military coup, and once again gaining inspiration from a successful model abroad, the Chilean coup of 1973. The Times again published an editorial praising the Chilean coup and hinting at the need for a similar solution in Britain. And it has since been officially confirmed that in 1975, a new plot was hatched to overthrow the Wilson government and establish a military dictatorship under Mountbatten, involving elements of the military and MI5. So, as in the 1960s, when there was a run on the pound and it was devalued, so this time the government capitulated to the IMF, which inflicted a harsh program of cuts. So once again, the workers rose up, and the decade ended with the so-called winter of discontent, when rubbish mounted in the streets and bodies were piling up in the cemeteries. So there followed then 18 years of a very different kind of Tory government under Thatcher. and after her overthrow, Beecher, which all but crippled trade union power and launched a wholesale demolition of the public sector. Now, at this point, I'd like to quote, there's a throwaway line in Trotsky, written in the 1920s, when he said, "Every serious bourgeois understands a very real danger from the profoundly disquieted proletarian masses. It's just because of this," he said, "that the wise bourgeoisie draws the conclusion that it is better not to sink fresh resources in industry." Now, that actually is a haunting quotation when you think that that's precisely what lies behind Thatcher's deliberate destruction of industry in the 1980s. She inflicted an industrial holocaust which saw Britain's industrial capacity fall by 1/4 within just 4 years, between 1980 and 1984. And as a result of the demolition of the British industrial capacity, Britain now presents a very different picture. The industrial working class is virtually annihilated. I'd like to quote an article by the journalist Aditya Chakraborty in The Guardian, he wrote a very interesting column where he talked about the television program. There's a television program in Britain called Dragon's Den, in which budding entrepreneurs pitch for investments for bright ideas from billionaire capitalists. And this is what Chakraborty said. They would pitch up with their patter, their shiny prototypes, and then when asked how they actually planned to make their goods, they would shrug off this most fundamental of questions with a single word: China. China. It had factories and shipping containers, and most of all, vast numbers of workers. The British no longer needed to cast themselves as makers. Instead, they could focus on the designing and the selling, as he put it, the dreaming and the bullshitting. If it was staff you wanted, you could offshore your work to Asia, or you could outsource it to an agency that relied on imported workers from Eastern Europe. So, as he put it, globalization came after the miners had lost, the bankers had won, the unions were at bay, and factories were being rebuilt as call centers. And Britain had become a society where they could enjoy manufacturing without manufacturers, products without producers, and work without a workforce. Britain now, then, is one of the most deindustrialized countries in Europe. Industrial production is now lower per capita than not only Germany and France, but the Czech Republic and Slovenia. Britain's dependence now on finance stifles investment in production, suppresses wages, and it squeezes suppliers. It's a byword now for low wages, low added value, and low prices. The dominant goal is shareholder profit, which is shoveled into property speculation, asset stripping, black money, parasitical, and even criminal activity. And one effect, by the way, is that the aggregate value of UK properties owned offshore has reached a colossal £170 billion. London has become the favourite base, for instance, of the Russian mafia. My own borough, Newham, which has the highest level of homelessness in the country, also has the highest rate of empty residences because of, particularly at the time of the Olympics, huge blocks were sprang up all over the neighbourhood, which were bought as simply as investment vehicles for laundered money by billionaires in Russia and China and Singapore and the Middle East and so on. To take one example, there's one empty luxury tower block in Canning Town, which is about a mile away from where I am now, which contains, all of the flats are empty, but 69 of those flats are owned by one single Singapore money launderer. And this is really what lies behind Brexit. The EU had created a continental-wide customs union and single market based on the imposition of common environmental standards and safeguards against competitive undercutting of wages, etc. And though irksome and routinely violated by cheating and so on, this had made some sense in a period of productive investment. When the question of Brexit first came up, I had assumed that the ruling class would push to stay in the EU, as they had done in the 1970s. Why give up the lucrative continental markets and the inexhaustible supply of cheap labour? And that's exactly why it had been so keen to join the EU in 1970. But what I had failed to take into account is that was when the industrial capitalists were the dominant sector of the British ruling class. As the British economy demolished its industrial sector and sank into speculative profiteering, these rules have become a constraint. That's the explanation for Brexit, the transition from industrial capitalism to the dominance of the traditional banking sector, and then to a decline into parasitic speculative capital. Following the collapse of the dot-com market, the banks themselves had increasingly resorted to criminal activity on an astronomical scale, costing £70 billion. And that's even before we take into account the 2008 crisis of crooked investments in hedge funds based on subprime mortgages. Brexit also, of course, gave them politically an opportunity to divert attention to the scapegoat of immigrant labour, inflaming ingrained imperialist, chauvinist and outright racist stereotypes. So nowadays, manufacturing production is outsourced and imported, and any pretense at strategic planning has been demolished. As a result, the economy has functioned like a fairground roller coaster, depending on so-called just-in-time management, which means risking everything on hair-raising gambles. Everything works fine until suddenly it doesn't. So it's true that obviously production restrictions and compressed inventories do reduce wastage, but it's the opposite of planning. It relies on a superstitious blind faith in market forces. Once the system hits a problem, it causes mayhem. And we see the same pattern in every crisis of the last few years. For instance, the 2008 financial crisis, because the banks had insufficient reserves of capital to absorb the losses caused by fraudulent investment, and so the result was a financial collapse. Take also the pandemic. In 2020, after the abandonment of strategic preparation for what was already known to be the certainty of impending global pandemics, society and production were brought juddering to a halt by the arrival of COVID-19. So in the same way now, the gluts and shortages arising from a lack of planning and investment have made the system seize up. It takes any random glitch to shut down production. There's simply not enough slack in the system to cope with the unexpected shocks caused by inadequate, just-in-time, in other words, barely manageable supply chains. And this disruption will continue. Shipping costs have quadrupled. The cost of raw materials for manufacturers has surged. So, for instance, we now, at the moment, one of the current crises in Britain is an acute shortage of gas. Global energy prices are at record highs. Gas prices have soared by 250% since the beginning of the year. But the UK has a particular crisis, but it has just 10 days worth of storage, and that's 1% of Europe's total storage capacity. Most countries on the continent have 4 or 5 times that amount. One entrepreneur was asked if this could shut down the country, and his reply, this is literally what he said, yeah, in which case then what we would do is you'd shut down industry. So manufacturers such as steel and chemicals have warned that they may have to shut down plants in Britain this winter. It's not yet a collapse, but it's a near miss. It's on the edge. So the decay of the infrastructure is felt everywhere. The petrol pumps have dried up, empty shelves in the supermarkets. E. coli was found in the water supply in one region recently. Spasmodic power cuts, failures of water supply. Car production is hit by the shortage of computer chips. And we have, particularly in Britain, the shortage of lorry drivers. The government had known in 2006 there was a significant shortage, but after Brexit, a quarter of Bulgarian and Romanian workers have left Britain. Food is being left, therefore, to rot on the farms. Restaurants are closing for lack of staff. Retailers have seen stock levels plunge to their lowest since 1983. And Britain has a shortage actually of 100,000 lorry drivers. So what does the government do? It's offered 5,000 temporary visas. And the number of applications have been received. We need 100,000, remember. It's offered 5,000. The number of applications, the total received, is 27. Because who's going to want to rush to Britain for 2 months' work in the knowledge that they're going to be kicked out again straight after that? And it's not only a question of distribution. The same applies to food production. The supermarkets have so crushed the primary food producers that farmers became completely dependent on EU subsidies. So now, as a result of Brexit, 4 out of every 10 British farmers have gone bankrupt. And listen to this statistic, the farmers are committing suicide at the rate of almost 3 per week. Then, of course, there's a pandemic. Britain, as a result, as I said, of the lack of planning, has the highest coronavirus death toll in Europe, the 8th per capita in the world, almost the equivalent, by the way, per capita to that of Brazil. We still have at least 500 deaths per week, and I think that number is now beginning to rise again. And the current death rate at 22 per million is more than double that of Germany, which is 10 million. Johnson was until recently bragging about Britain's vaccination record, but it's now been beaten by Portugal, Spain, and Ireland. So what does all this mean for us? So while production slows and grinds, the inflation rate is rising at its fastest rate for 25 years, almost 5%. And what we're getting is a return to the curse of the 1970s, which they called stagflation. In other words, stagnation of production simultaneously with inflation. Inflation adjusted average pay now, by the way, is still below what it was in February 2008. And if you take that in money terms, it's workers have lost on average £5,900 a year. The attacks on living standards don't end there. I mean, look at it. We've got on top of inflation, we've got the public sector pay freeze. We've got a rise in so-called national insurance contributions. In other words, it brings basic rate taxation to its highest ever level for ordinary workers. The recent £20 week cut in universal credit, which affects 6 million families, that again is the biggest ever overnight cut in social security. We've got the end of the furlough scheme, which had up to now kept 12 million workers in employment, which means that we can be sure that unemployment now is going to soar. We have already over 2.5 million households already in fuel poverty, which is defined as that they pay more than 10% of their net income on energy bills. And there's a prospect of 15% rise now in electricity and gas bills, which will plunge 3.5 million people into fuel poverty. And our last statistic, already 2.5 million people are using food banks regularly in the UK. So the effects of underinvestment are felt in every aspect of civilized life. It's also true of the entire infrastructure. State school spending has fallen by 9% in real terms over the last decade. Per pupil spending from 8,000 to 6,900. Art, sport, music, drama, languages have all been cut from the curriculum. So Britain is experiencing a sort of cultural decay. It's also being stripped of its social infrastructure. In the last 10 years, 7,000 bank branches have shut. That means 2 every day, by the way. 760 youth clubs have shut. A pub closes every 12 hours. Nearly 130 libraries were scrapped in the last year. Parks are disappearing. Playgrounds are being sold off. High streets are deserted, leaving just charity shops and betting shops. So in this situation, our politicians boast that welfare provision is the most generous in the world. The truth is it's number 17. If you take, for instance, unemployment benefits, in Britain, it's equivalent to 1/8 of the recipient's previous salary. In France, 57%. In Germany, 2/3. In Italy, 3/4. So in other words, Britain falls way, way, way behind the other major European countries. And together with these material attacks have come unprecedented political threats from this Johnson government. The virtual scrapping of the Human Rights Act and a judicial review and of EU-related environmental and human rights safeguards. There's impunity granted for military and security forces abuses, banning of protest marches, constituency boundaries gerrymandered, millions of voters disenfranchised by the imposition of rules imposing proof of ID on voters and so on. And I'm sorry to go on with this Jeremiad of complaints, but one last one. Against this background, Johnson is relying on vile populist patter to cover his tracks, having always deployed smutty racist abuse. You know, he's known for phrases like the pickaninnies with watermelon smiles and calling women, saying that they look like bank robbers or letterboxes. He's suddenly hit on another afterthought justification for Brexit. He suddenly says, denouncing decades of strategic reliance on cheap immigrant labour, he now says, well, what was it all about is we want a high wage, high skills economy. In other words, this is politics by virtuoso improvisation. And his bluff, of course, can be imposed very, very easily. If he wants high pay in the public sector, all he needs to do is to raise the public sector wage instead of driving it down by offering a decent public sector wage rise. In the private sector, he can raise it overnight also by raising the minimum wage. That's in his power to do tomorrow, both of them. And a deep split is beginning to undermine the cohesion of the ruling class. The Tories have been taken over, in effect, by UKIP. The old grandees were unceremoniously sent packing. But now a further split is developing between Johnson, the irresponsible populist demagogue who keeps talking about levelling up. He's even created, it's almost sounds like, you know, fantasy. He's actually created a so-called Ministry for Levelling Up. That's actually what it's called. And combining, of course, this demagogic call for high wages with anti-immigrant rhetoric. So a split between Johnson, the populist on one side, and Sunak, the prudent accountant, on the other. So it's in effect, Sunak is imposing a continuation of the harsh austerity policies pursued ever since 2010. The manufacturing wing of the capitalist class has described Johnson's conference speech as, in the words of the Adam Smith Institute, bombastic but vacuous and economically illiterate. The conservative think tank Bright Blue said the public will soon tire of Boris's banter if the government doesn't get a grip of mounting crises, price rises, tax rises, fuel shortages, labour shortages. One example of, by the way, I have to just mention this one, of flirtation with dangerous populist demagogy is the British government's current conflict with the EU over the so-called Northern Ireland Protocol. In deliberately violating the treaty that they had concluded only a year ago, Johnson is putting at risk both the entire Northern Ireland peace settlement and the Brexit deal with Europe, which means a threat of further sectarian conflict, the possible secession of Northern Ireland, and even a trade war with Europe. And we can really, with all these elements, we can sniff in the air the future development of some kind of radical populist movement, abetted, no doubt, by a fascist paramilitary force. It's interesting that UKIP, for instance, has teamed up with Tommy Robinson, who is an outright fascist provocateur. But having given all this bad news, if you like, there's another angle. The prospect of a renewed combativity on the part of the working class, because labour shortages are beginning to tilt the balance. The irrationality of the system is shown by the fact that while there are 1.5 million unemployed, there are also 1.2 million labour vacancies. And it's an indication that the training infrastructure is completely unfit for purpose. But as a result of this, there is already a rise in strikes, especially, of course, among delivery drivers. Trade union membership overall rose by 120,000 within the last year. Thatcher had exercised the spectre of trade unionism, but now it's beginning to haunt her successors. And in other words, with the decline of industrial production, what superficially looked like a deproletarianization of society, because that was its principal purpose, has turned into its opposite. Yes, workers are being fired and rehired on worse terms. Permanent jobs are being replaced by casual labor. But the harsh realities and conditions have political consequences. New layers are becoming proletarianized. There are frequent local strikes of teachers. And which are the two biggest and longest national strikes in recent years? Those are the university lecturers and hospital doctors. Now, both of these workforces were previously definitely considered to be middle class, and they're now highly organized and highly combative. And at the other end of the spectrum, we see that new unions are springing up among the near enslaved underclass, if you like, the millions of fast food workers, couriers, and office cleaners. And how is this reflected politically? Now let's come to the important issue. What are the lessons of the 29 election? Was it a shift to the right, as it's been presented? This is an example of Goebbels' maxim, use the big lie. Just as the big lie about anti-Semitism has been used to smear Corbyn on the left, the big lie is that 2019 was that Labour's worst result since 1935. Now, it's true that in terms of parliamentary seats, that is so. But the people who say this, this argument comes from the very same sources that in other contexts are always decrying the voting system as being distorted and unrepresentative. So was this actually a resounding triumph for the Tories? If you look at the voting figures, what seemed to be a huge surge of support for Johnson's Tory party is actually a myth. The Tories gained overall just 330,000 votes. It's true that Labour lost 2,600,000. But where did those votes go? They didn't go, as we see, or certainly most of them didn't go to the Tory party. Where did they go? If you look at the voting figures, first of all, the overall turnout dropped by 6.4%, and that accounts for some hundreds of thousands of those votes. The Lib Dems gained 330,000 votes, and the SNP gained 264,000. This is compared to 2017. Now, what is it that the Lib Dems had and the SNP had? They were the most resolute in opposing Brexit, and Brexit was the key issue of the 2019 campaign. So in other words, the result was skewed both ways by Brexit. The supporters of Brexit were pulled in the direction of the Tory party. The opponents of Brexit, who were confused by the ambiguity of Labour's position, many of them went to the Lib Dems or to the SNP in Scotland. Remember that in 2017, just 4 years ago, Corbyn regained all the 4 million votes that were lost by Blair and Brown, except in Scotland. And it was in England and Wales, it was Labour's best ever result. Even in 2019, let's remember that Corbyn won 10 million votes, which is not a bad start. It's more than Miliband gained in 2015, Brown in 2010, and even more than Blair won in 2005 when he won the election. So I think we can be sure if Corbyn was still the Labour leader, Labour would probably be 20 points ahead today in the polls. Starmer, of course, is deliberately destroying the Labour Party. He's already lost the party at least 150,000 members and probably a lot more. He's lost £13 million, plunging the Labour Party into or very close towards bankruptcy. And in 3 by-elections, he lost 2/3 of the total vote that was achieved in the 2017 election. Why does Labour remain the main opposition party? Just for two reasons, of course. One, the two-party voting system, and two, the affiliation of the trade unions. But neither of these factors are tablets of stone. Remember that Labour itself beat the two-party system when it replaced the Liberals at the beginning of the last century. The SNP replaced Labour in Scotland, coming from nowhere to be by far the biggest party in Scotland. When it comes to trade union affiliation, the RMT and the Bakers are already disaffiliated, and they could well be followed by the FBU, the CWU, and who knows, perhaps later by Unite and other unions. And meanwhile, there are hundreds of thousands of disenfranchised Corbyn supporters who were actually paid up Labour members in the past. One last point about that. The suggestion was made in previous discussions that many workers nowadays consider themselves to be middle class. This is absolutely not the case. And I want to quote, there's an authoritative statistical institution called British Social Attitudes. This is what they have reported. Despite a long-term decline in the size of the working class to just 25%, that's by their definition, the proportion of the public who identify themselves as working class has remained stable over time. A majority of people still identify as working class. 60% say they are working class, compared with 40% who say they're middle class. Just under half, 47% of those in jobs that are classified as managerial and professional consider themselves to be working class. This proportion who consider themselves working class has not changed since 1983. Now, just think about that. In 1983, that was before Thatcher's shutdown of the mines and major industries. At that time, 60% said we are working class. Today, the same figure. Still 60% say that they're working class. This is a reflection of the factors that I described earlier. Now let's look at the youth.
You've had 30 minutes, Roger, just so that you know. Carry on a bit longer, it's fine. Yeah.
I'm coming close to the end. Sorry about that.
All right.
So among the youth, the surge in youth votes came in for Labour in 2017. But even in 2019, among the 18 to 24-year-olds, Labour had a lead over the Tories of 43%, a massive lead. And also in 2019, among working people, and this is from reliable statisticians, Labour beat the Tories among working people. I want to quote the Institute of Economic Affairs, which is a very sober, bourgeois institution. And this is what they say about the attitudes among youth. Younger people really do quite consistently express hostility to capitalism and positive views of socialist alternatives. The common argument that they will grow out of it is simply not borne out by the data. There are no detectable differences between the economic attitudes of people in their late teens and people in their early 40s. These attitudes may be a preview of mainstream opinion in Britain tomorrow. Now there's something to cheer us up. I'm continuing the quote, at every general election from the late 1970s to the early 1990s, and again in 2010, as many or more under 45 voters chose the Tories as Labour. But the radicalisation of the young, which has also happened in other parts of Europe and in the United States, is a new feature of 21st century Western politics. And it was blamed by, they say, on 0 hours contracts, exploitative internships, graduates stuck in cafe jobs, stagnant wages, precariousness, and so on. Let's take the opinion polls. Among young people, 70% say that they favour socialism. And how do we know that that's not just distorted statistics? From the youth surge for Labour under Corbyn. And is it any wonder in the circumstances we described? It's interesting in this connection, Starmer at the Labour Party conference just a couple of weeks ago, he made just one electoral pledge. He said, I'm going to invest in youth mental health care. And that's very good, and it's very much needed. But does he think that depression and anxiety among youth are just random medical issues? Does he think that they're not related to the imposition of a Victorian education curriculum, the shutdown of youth clubs and sports and leisure facilities, soaring student debt, hopeless job prospects, racism, police bullying, stop and search, and other effects of despair, including gang wars and drug consumption? A new youth rebellion is obviously on the cards. It could come tomorrow, very much like in 2011. And let's think, what was Starmer's record in 2011? At that time, he was Director of Public Prosecutions, and he personally was responsible for imposing draconic jail sentences. 1,300 young people were jailed for a total of 1,800 years. This is the mental health therapy that is being promised by Starmer. I just want to sum up then. What we're witnessing is the chronic decline and the death agony of British capitalism, where once it was the workshop of the world, today it's losing its last remnants of productive industry, most of them by now just assembly plants owned by Japanese, Indian, and other foreign companies, which had only nested here because it was a springboard into the EU, and which are now on the point of leaving. Where once Britain ruled on an empire in which the sun never sets, following the collapse of the British Empire has come the disintegration of the United Kingdom itself. It's just one referendum away from losing Scotland. And the current convulsions over the status of Northern Ireland following Brexit mean that before long, Northern Ireland could easily conclude some kind of reunification deal with the Irish Republic. Because it's interesting that despite the prejudices of the Unionists, a majority of both communities in Northern Ireland opposed Brexit. So Great Britain could soon be just England and, I suppose, perhaps Wales. It could sink to the status of an offshore island off the European mainland, a tourist spot for sightseers visiting such ancient relics as the Tower of London and Shakespeare's birthplace, and perhaps also taking in the whiskey stills of the neighbouring country, Scotland, in a double bill. The scandals also of the British monarchy are not, as some argue, just irrelevant sideshows. It's wrong to dismiss these as a trivial diversionary soap opera, because the disgrace of Prince Andrew, the distaste for Charles and Camilla, and the abdication of Harry are precursors to the demise of the dynasty itself. And where it's true the current monarchy, the current monarch is held in some reverence, once her reign comes to an end, the surviving members of the dynasty are unlikely to hold a similar appeal. And so, along with Britain's decay, a new faction has displaced the old establishment. Over the centuries, since the end of the English Civil War, behind a permanent royal facade, political power shifted from the aristocracy to industry to finance. And Johnson now has ruthlessly squashed the remnants of the old patrician establishment, the captains of industry and the banks, the clerks and the Heseltines, and the party which ruled England for 350 years has fallen prey to a bunch of property speculators and hedge fund managers. And this explains the spasms currently convulsing the Tory party. There's a brilliant history of the years preceding the First World War called The Strange Death of Liberal England. If any comrade hasn't read it, I strongly recommend it. In it, the author describes the demise of the Liberal Party and ascribed it to the rise of the suffragette movement, the Irish independence struggle, and the growth of trade unionism. The ruling party today is the new face of UKIP and the Brexit Party. They split the oldest and most stable political party in Europe to bring about the beginning of what you could call the strange death of conservative England. So today, both the two main parties are facing existential crises. This is not the place to be discussing further the Labour Party, but it is in the throes of a historic and long overdue split, inflicted with ruthless determination by one side and building up pressure for an explosion on the other. It's up to now, true, a one-sided split, but nevertheless systematic and determined. Inevitably and irrevocably, a new political expression of resistance and revolution must and will arise. So in this situation, the title of our journal, which we're going to resume publication of this month, On the Brink, is, I think, especially applicable to the world's first capitalist power. Okay, thanks, comrades. Sorry I went on a bit over time.
Thanks, Roger. That was absolutely excellent. All I can say is if anybody fancies being an HGV driver in Paradise, Britain, get in an orderly queue. 27. Right, okay, thanks, Roger. Who'd like to come in first? Anybody? Any volunteers? Anybody want to ask any questions? I think everybody's stunned into silence, aren't they?
No, I'd want to say something.
Off you go, Matt.
Right, okay. Yeah, thanks, Roger. That was a good, interesting survey of 100 and some odd years of British imperialism. And I think, it's difficult to respond in 5 minutes, but I think, it's more just to sort of point at certain things. Clearly, obviously, it's a decline, as you say, it's a decline in Britain, and not only in Britain, but also of capitalism in general. And I think that the problem is obviously that facing us is that the beast doesn't just roll over and die; it has to be killed off, and that's a job for the working class. And the question is, what's the nature of the working class, and how well organised is it, and can it actually basically organise itself and develop the degree of consciousness needed to do the job? And this is what's in front of us. I think that you talked about the whole business of Thatcherism and the development in terms of deindustrialisation, which also, of course, is notable in the rest of the world, particularly the US, where you can see obviously has cities that look like the.
Sorry, massive accident. Muted you. I was trying to put your hand down. Sorry, carry on.
Right. Okay. I shall lower my hand there.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Right. I didn't think it was that boring. So the thing is that what the significance of Thatcherism, of course, and of course Reagan and equivalents, Volcker and so on in the US, is the switch to finance capital. The fact that you move from industrial based capitalism to a finance capitalism, based as Marx points out on money as end-to-end prime, right? Not involving production or any tangentially involving production. And actually, of course, as we see at the moment, and in fact, of course, the relation between finance capital and production gets ever more and more distant. And we wind up with a situation where we have a huge overhang of what you could call fictitious capital, i.e., money that doesn't actually have any relation to production at all, and therefore, of course, creates these explosive questions, as in 2008, when everything clearly the basis of this stuff gets kicked out, and of course, obviously the questions raised by likes of Warren Buffett, in which he says, this obsession with derivatives and so on, actually, sticks, chunks of explosive underneath the functioning of the entire system. The fact that now you've got speculative capital is now sitting there with a net, sort of nominal value much larger than the actual productive capacity of the world in any given year or even multiple years. And so, the system becomes, as it is and clearly has been since particularly 2008, seriously unstable. I think the other thing that you have to note also is, of course, is the integration in terms of there's no one country in which can point to any function that it performs entirely by itself. I know the Trumpites, for instance, try to find a car they could call an American car. It doesn't exist, clearly because all of this, the production of anything, is now integrated internationally. and as we can see clearly. And this also poses huge questions for the working class, in terms of the organisation of the working class. Because while capital may organise itself internationally and clearly does so for its own purposes on many occasions, and uses that against the working class by shifting production and so on and so forth to its own advantage, and to, in many cases, to the disadvantage of the working class. The working class has this problem to how does it actually organise internationally, and can it do so effectively? And it's not really answered that question, unfortunately, and it poses this whole point. I think the other thing, the other point you raised, to go through a few others, is the whole question of Brexit. Brexit's interesting because obviously what you see actually with the forces behind Brexit were the most predatory, speculative parts of finance capital. What's his face? The guy who financed the UKIP and he was obviously a mate of, runs his own insurance company in Gibraltar, and these guys, and it was quite clear. What was interesting actually was it was quite clear from what was written and clearly from the interests themselves. It wasn't just written down, but that the majority of the ruling class itself was not in favour of Brexit. Clearly so. It was not really an advantage to them to do it. Obviously, to a significant section, because obviously Britain now essentially is a money washing machine. London is a money washing machine for large chunks of the world. And we see, if we look at the sort of recent stuff, that all of those revelations in terms of, the sort of moving money across to, evasion of taxes, and et cetera, all of that, the Panama Papers, the Pandora Papers, et cetera, all of that centred in London, all of it, in part. The interesting thing is, of course, some of it could actually be centred in New York, but clearly the US is not interested in the publications of those bits. But that's essentially, it's interesting that you get all this revelation, that it points out the role of that sector. So, but as I say, there's this split, but they didn't want to expose it. They did not want to conduct a major row in public between two sections of the ruling class. Quite clearly so. So the majority section was prepared to roll over, and did roll over for the minority. That was really interesting that they would do that. And then, of course, as you say, in the Tory party, those people who were actually, or are, clearly, the historic people who actually were closely integrated into particularly into production elements of capital were removed by Johnson, in favour of the speculators, the hedge funds, and so on and so forth, and a particularly predatory and populist and deeply unstable political formation. I think the thing that they've got also is this problem that the system itself, as you say, the problem being, of course, after 2008, the system itself is really in a very profound crisis. The word crisis almost is redundant because the depth is such. And it continues, and it's clear they don't have any answer. But besides, obviously, this sort of the application of austerity, which is nakedly a means of putting the boot on the neck of the working class, and it becomes even more openly that. As time passes, as we can see, they can manage. They can produce money to do what they want. They're clearly just not prepared to allow, even a living to large chunks of the population. You can see with the likes of the UC card that they actually clearly just want people to die, as was pointed out this morning.
Matt, you've had quite a few minutes now. We've got a few.
Yeah. Right, thanks.
We finished, yeah? Okay, right, Ken.
Right. Thank you very much, Roger, for that talk. Just a brief observation. People tend to forget that Thatcher largely won her second election because of the Falklands War. If that hadn't happened, she'd probably have lost. What is Boris Johnson's Falklands. I suggest it's COVID, because like COVID, Argentina was a threat which was well advertised to the government but ignored. And the resolution of that threat was done through massive expenditure and the unnecessary loss of life, much like COVID. So I think it's quite probable, and I deeply hope I'm wrong, that Boris Johnson will somehow present his handling of COVID as a triumph in much the same way as Thatcher represented her handling of the Falklands as a triumph, when in fact both were failures to recognize a threat and take appropriate action beforehand. Now, what does that mean? It means, I think, sadly, that Johnson is quite likely to win the next general election. You could argue he doesn't need a Falklands because Starmer is so inept as an opposition leader. But it does mean that we have, I think, to develop a strategy to cope with another 6 or 7 years of Tory government. And that's quite a difficult place to plan for. I hope Roger's right that we will see the growth of a genuine socialist opposition, but it will have to work outside of Parliament, I think, for the next 6 or 7 years before it gets a chance to change anything. So, and I hope everything I said is completely wrong and that Boris loses the next election, but that's my fear. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Now, we did have John Gibson next, but he seems to disappear. So, Steve Zeltzer, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I want to say, sorry, I came in late to the discussion, but I think we're obviously in a new epoch, not just in Britain, but internationally, that has to be confronted. I mean, I think one of the key situations now internationally is the growth of fascism. And I don't know if people have followed, but fascists have attacked the Italian Union headquarters, enjoying with workers around the issue of mandates with COVID. And in Australia, the same thing happened. There was a demonstration of construction workers. The fascists joined it and attacked the union. So the rise of fascism has to be looked at seriously internationally, because this crisis, there's no solution obviously under capitalism, bourgeois capitalism, but there is a movement of the billionaires, section of the capitalist class, towards fascism, towards dictatorship. And they're well financed. Bannon and these other people are getting big money to organize internationally, including in Britain, obviously. So I think that the other issue from my point of view is social democracy. We don't have social democracy in the United States. We have the Democratic Party, an openly capitalist party. But social democracy has not been able to solve this crisis, and because it requires a real complete restructuring of society. And I think that in the United States, the Democrats now, the crisis of Biden is that Biden is basically paralyzed. He has abandoned what he said he was going to do, and Sanders, who supported him, has also abandoned even national health care, for example. They've dropped even national health care, which was a big point for the Democratic platform. So what does this mean for the working class in Britain and the United States? One is, I think we need to go to the policy of united fronts to unite the working class on class struggle issues internationally. And I agree with the comrades who are saying this is not just a British issue, it's an international issue for the working class. So we have to have a united front strategy on action internationally, linking up workers around the world. That is critical. And we had an action for the Italian general strike of the logistic workers. And on Wednesday, there's going to be a general strike of the Korean workers. Actually, a general strike for equality, which is quite interesting to have a general strike for equality. But anyway, so we're going to have action at the Korean consulate in San Francisco. But I do think the united front policy means that we unite with workers who we have differences with, or workers that have differences, but they unite around united front around class issues that they can unite internationally against temporary work, part-time contract labor. These are global issues that can unite workers in Britain, unite workers in the United States on an international level. And I think building a new international working class movement is decisive, and linking up these workers internationally, that is really critical. And with this medium that we're using today, Zoom, it's possible to do that, to link up workers directly internationally. So I think those are important issues. And of course, in the United States, there is no working class party, mass working class party. We are for building a mass democratic labor party with a program to solve this crisis. But I do think we have a lot of opportunities, because workers around the world are facing the same fight, facing the same multinationals, and need to link up, see more and more the need to link up internationally to solve their own problems, which can't be obviously solved in one country. Thank you, comrades.
Thanks, Steve. That's bang on 5 minutes. Well done. Right, so David Hempson next.
Roger, I think you did a commanding review of all the issues, the historical context of British capitalism, the contradictions within the labor movement, and you pointed to the extraordinary reaction internationally by world capitalism whenever Labour Party, even with a reformist program or a program of modest reforms, tries to implement them, and the catastrophe that they want to, extend to British economy, when that's attempted. That's why this discussion is so important, because in the international context, Britain, which is historically the origin of industrial capitalism, is in such a deep crisis. And yet everywhere in the world, the labor movement and other and the capitalists as well are looking to see at the political developments, in Britain. And what we've seen, if I could give a broad sort of introduction to the issue, is an attempt by a section of the British ruling class to reconstitute the nation, to divide the working class as never before, and to take up a number of lunatic policies, to maintain their grip politically. I mean, what we saw with the entrance of Britain to the EU with some reluctance, it caused a lot of confusion in the labor movement, a confusion which has been reflected in a number of the historic statements by leaders of the Labour Party and in the labor movement, that of a kind of a nationalist view, of the entry, rather than an internationalist view of labor solidarity. And this has been a major political problem in the labor movement. So what we've seen in Britain in the recent period with Boris is a rise of an anti-globalized movement in the Conservative Party, and putting that forward. And although Rogers pointed out the limits, of that electorally, a certain base, that is being created for Boris. It may vanish, and we will see it vanish over time, as Roger has seen, but politics seems to be lagging behind events. The crisis is acute, but the political expression of it is very confused. So you see Boris reinforcing borders, anti-immigration policy, wanting to headbutt with the EU, reckless in relation to Northern Ireland, and on many other issues in relation to the EU. And being an acrobat, walking a tightrope, but somehow not slipping and falling, somehow managing to hold on to it. And in a sense, Brexit was a victory for Boris. And it was the most profound division that Britain has experienced in the post-war period, and he was the victor out of it. Totally unstable, absolutely crazy in terms of the logic of capital, but actually winning some basis, for his rule and not losing. I mean, the arithmetic of voting is important, but somehow or other he's managed to turn the parliamentary majority into something fairly stable. And he's even predicting that he'll rule for another decade. It's incredible. In other words, what we're predicting when we say that there will be a change and a revolution in Britain is an utter transformation of consciousness, something that's never been seen actually anywhere in any developed country. A change from passive acceptance, of this crazy rule to absolute defiance and organization against such a development.
You have 5 minutes, David.
Okay, so we see that Boris is now going to be chairing, or at least being the chief host on climate change at a time when there's an energy crisis, as Roger has explained, in which there's a desperate holding on to fossil fuel economy and trying to restabilize on that basis. In fact, going against every international advice that the capitalists are giving to each other. Boris is saying that he can deal with the question of inequality, but let me just give you some figures on that to see how
You just be
deep it
fairly
is.
brief, David, because there's quite a few.
I'm
hands.
watching myself. I've only taken 30 seconds since the last warning.
Yes, fine. Okay, yeah, right.
Okay. First of all, in the lower income group in Britain are something like 20% larger than in France. And at the upper 10% of society compared to France, the British ruling strata has 17% higher levels of income than in Britain. In other words, contemporary countries in Europe are doing much better in terms of equality than in Britain. I won't go into the reflection on a geographic basis, but that's a division on a class basis. Now what we see is a crisis which I would say is a Brexit capitalist crisis. It has Brexit characteristics, and it's necessary, I think, in my view, to put that forward as the way in which the crisis has unfolded, because a massive political education is needed for that strata, which is half the population of Britain voted, more than half, voted for Brexit. And the political education of that strata is just beginning. And we've seen a division between the official movements, the parties and so forth, and the youth. Roger has correctly pointed to the tremendous rising consciousness of the youth. But the youth is not particularly present in more politically organized groups, and certainly not in the left at the moment, which is a tragedy which we have to address, as well as look to the traditional organization of the British workers and the trade unions, the rising strike movement, and so forth. So let's look
Okay,
to
David,
that.
you've had about 7 minutes now. The limit's actually 5. There's quite a few hands up, so if you could just
Okay, well,
finish
let me
off
just
quick. I'm sorry
conclude
to interrupt you, but we
that.
have
No,
got
not a problem.
Yeah,
Thank you,
okay.
Pam. Ciao.
Got it now, yeah? Okay. You might get a chance to come back in later. Right, so Steve Forrest next.
Thanks very much. I'll work out how to bring the raise hand down in a second. I think an excellent lead off from Roger, very, very interesting. I think food for thought and a welcome change for me rather than a lecture from on high. There's a lot of food for thought and detail. But just a couple of points. I think the points made by Steve, I wasn't going to speak really, but I think the points made by Steve from, I think it's in America, California, I think, on the social democracy, I think is absolutely correct, because I think if you ever wanted a test case to failure of left reformism and left social democracy, it is the Corbyn years, yeah? And I think we have to be very, very clear that that is a test case, a laboratory case on the failure of left reformism to seize a moment. And they were unable to seize that moment. They were unable completely. You know, I've got 5 minutes, but, you know, I'm just going to make some, if you like, general points. But I think that's really, really important. And just on the other point that I think the first speaker made, Boris and the Falklands War and what is his moment, I'm not sure COVID will be his moment. I've currently got a friend of mine waiting for a GP appointment. They're sitting outside in the car park. There's people out there who not come in cars, but come by public transport, who are, this is not an it's not a particularly poor area of London I live in the northwest suburb, and they have arrived, and some people have not even got coats, and they're waiting outside because there's not enough staff members to have them inside. It's absolutely complete chaos. I'm not sure, as we approach the winter and go through the winter with cuts that have took place over 10 years, and COVID, rising cases, and flu, etc., that this will turn out to be, in fact, it's potentially the opposite. I think, so really, I think I'm just going to pose a question, really, I think. And I think, again, Steve's point was really, really interesting, because where does this go? And Rogers, this could go for a youth explosion, absolutely. In the 2017 election, I went on the Rayners Lane housing estate. That means nothing to you guys, but it's a very working class estate in our area. And there were young people queuing outside the polling stations, 200-300 of them, to vote for Jeremy Corbyn. Such enthusiasm that I have never seen. It was quite astonishing. That youth, as Roger correctly pointed out, have been offered nothing by the last 4 years. Offered absolutely no way out, no college, just a lack of hope. You know, no real jobs, minimum wage poor, blah blah blah. I don't need to repeat what Roger said on that. So where does that expression of youth anger go? 2011 riots have been hinted at. There's no LPYS. There's no pole of attraction. There's no trade union youth that are going to reach out to these young people per se. Where would that go? I think the other interesting point is today, Dominic Raab, as the Justice Secretary, has raised openly that politicians can reject the decisions made by courts and move towards executive powers. This is quite a dramatic point that has been raised today by Dominic Raab. A professor of law at Cambridge University has suggested that this is mission creep towards executive powers. This is Britain. This is not Italy or France that has a particular tradition of this, Spain, but this is Britain. So where does this go? Class struggle, yeah. My union, GMB, has recently had, you know, we don't even ballot for strike action. Normally it's quite a right-wing union, but we're balloting for strike action regularly. Drivers in Yodel, don't know, you might have them in America, I don't know, but they're delivery drivers. They recently had a 98% ballot for industrial action. On the basis of that, 2 days later, they got offered £18 an hour to drive the Yodel delivery vehicles. That is a tremendous show of power. So really, I'm just posing the question here based on what I've heard, which is really interesting. Food for thought for all of us, that we obviously have to continue our work in the unions, Labour Party, or whatever formulation that takes. This is not that discussion, but we have the possibility of a mass social explosion, not just amongst the youth, but amongst people that are queuing outside doctor surgeries, etc., etc. And the ruling class moving towards possibly executive powers, Johnson, and every point that Steve and Roger have made, and the working class on the move. I think Britain is, alongside many other countries in Europe, has got a lot of combustible material. Trotsky said that Britain could plan for centuries in advance. We don't even plan what happened yesterday, you know, and I think that is the reality. And just to finish before the chair, very strong chair. I do like you, Sir Chair. You're very, very strong. I sat here in one meeting before, and you were very, very strong. But I'll just this is just in the Week magazine. It's quite a good read. It's short, quite a lot of short summary articles. But this is only 20% of people say they trust the government to do the right thing. 20% of people trust the government that won a major majority only 2 years ago. 71% are worried about rising gas prices, 49% about shortage of petrol and groceries, and 48% think they are not doing a good job on the pandemic, and that is now before we approach winter. There's a role for us. This is not an organisational discussion, obviously, in the union, Labour Party or whatever, but I think there's an awful lot of combustible material that I think Roger's lead off was exceptional, but I think Steve's points really struck me, because it really could, in Britain even, take a mood towards a reactionary position, and we need to be very careful of that and very, very warning of that possible development, which was hinted at by Roger very well. But I thought Steve's points struck me very, very well with the link to possible fascism. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Steve. There's some excellent points, very well put there. Thanks for sticking more or less within the time. Temos, you're next.
Hello. Yes, listening to Roger, it was a very sobering story of Britain and what's happening today. Nevertheless, when you reached today's events, I started thinking about what would I say about Cyprus. And although the history would be completely different, Britain is a big country, Cyprus is a joke of a country. In the final years, the disintegration of capitalism and the whole mess they are finding themselves in, it's the same thing in Cyprus, exactly the same thing, in a more caricature and more vulgar way, but the same phenomena happen here. And I'm sure that if we see in other countries, I'm thinking of the US, for example, the same phenomena happen everywhere. And it is a sure pointer that we are not talking about national problems, but we're talking about an international phenomenon. And this is something that we should never forget. And I want especially to mention the question of the changing relationship between industrial capitalists and the traditional banking sector, and what's happening today to world capitalism. Capitalism is changing. It's not the same as we had before. It has been mentioned also that the working class is changing as well. And we have to be very clear that our analysis take this into account. And one thing that is very important is we have to be very careful when I say that Boris Johnson is representing this finance capital. I think it's just the opposite that is happening. Boris Johnson may be a clown. Trump was a clown, but his support was not among these new finance capital rich people. His support was probably in more traditional capitalists that are losing out their power and their influence in society. And I think this is this carries with it some sectors of the working class as well that are also being threatened by this new form of capitalism that is emerging. And this also must make us think how we approach our work. I mean, Corbyn, it has been said that he had a chance that he missed. And I think that the 2017 election was the pinnacle of his success, and that's where he could go forward in a much more aggressive way and win the people and go forward. The reason he didn't do that is not just because he didn't think of it. There wasn't enough analysis among the left in general, more connection of left intellectual thinking with workers, and there was no real force to drive in the right way. So that's very important. But this also should make us think that, in fact, we have been making a mistake all these times. I'm talking about the left in general. That we were thinking that we shall convince the working class to revolt. This is not the case. The working class will revolt. It's what we do in this revolt that matters. And in this way, we should see what happens both in the Labour Party and the left in general in these coming years, because Boris Johnson's re-election may be a disaster, but first of all, it will be a disaster for Starmer. And I think we should be very careful on how we work and take into account all this, because Starmer, he's not banking on the support of the working class. He's banking on the support of the capitalists, and he's trying to present himself as the representative, their representative in society. And that's how he's going to claim the replacement of Boris Johnson with himself.
That's 5 minutes you've had, Temo, so you
It's fine, I've just finished.
to the end of it. Yeah, is that okay? Yeah. All right, thanks very much. Larry is next.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you very much. Thank you, Roger, for the analysis on the coming crisis. It gave me, in equal terms, despair and optimism in your analysis. But I think that understanding it and what we do about it are two different things. I think if we understand Roger's analysis correctly, then what we should be doing is building community support and defence systems to take the struggle forward. The trade union structures in workplaces and community representatives giving leadership. Those are the sort of things we should be concentrating on. The way forward is, in my opinion, is with workers' democracy leading to democratic Republican socialism. If we don't have that as a foundation within our struggle, then I think we're doomed, because democracy is at the basis of all the crisis that is happening to us at the moment. And that was underlined, although it wasn't actually said in Roger's contribution. And our future is based upon an internationalism, which other speakers have spoken about. Not fighting on false fronts that we're doing at the moment, i.e. staying in or outside the Labour Party. The Labour Party and the TUC will be lost in the tide of resistance and change if the predictions that are being put forward are correct. The reformism of the Labour Party will fall away. They won't be seen as leaders of the youth and the current communities. The use of social media networks like this are key to highlighting the opportunities for us in these difficult times. We have to come up with, in my opinion, radical thinking about what happens if this crisis does appear. What are we going to do? Sit and talk about it on the social media, or are we going to organise ourselves out in the communities to do something about it? We have networks that are already there, such as the food banks that were mentioned earlier. They need to be considered a target in the initial stages of coming under workers' control, and they will be under democratic system that needs to challenge the problems that we have, like the gas prices. What are we going to do? Just pay them, or are we going to resist and say, no, we're not going to pay the prices, but we're going to continue to use the gas? And if they turn the gas off, what are we going to do about that? These are the questions that I think we have to ask ourselves. My wife Jackie just mentioned something about the youth. How do we engage the youth within the education and the structural understanding of trade unions? And that is what Jackie said. Well, why do we not have introduce within the structure of the trade unions a no contribution free system for anybody under 25? The amount of people that would join unions without, because first thing they do, whenever I spoke to people about joining a trade union, say, how much does it cost? How can I afford that when I'm on 0 hours? We've got to look at that objectively and say that anybody under 25 years of age can join a trade union for educational and organisational purposes free of charge. We need to make that clear about why we're doing it, and the necessity of building youth into the trade unions. We will certainly put it through our trade union branch in Hastings, and I don't see why that shouldn't get traction, because we need to do essential things in organising ourselves. And I've said this to other groups, is that we talk about the working class, but we don't talk to them. And that's, I think, this is our fundamental problem. I mean, we all consider ourselves working class, but we need to take that by example into different areas of like the education system, the health service, and industry in itself. And these are the things, by example, we have to build towards. Thank you very much, Pam.
Thanks, Larry. Thanks for sticking to your 5 minutes. That's brilliant. Eddie's next.
Thank you, Pam. Thanks, Roger, for a great lead off. And I agree with a lot of what Larry has just said. It's not for nothing that Lenin called his newspaper Iskra, which meant the spark. I think we have a situation today where the old is dying and the new is not yet born. And that we have a situation where many activists know that the task we have to accomplish is much, much bigger than perhaps was originally felt in the enthusiasm of the Corbyn years. That many young people have dropped away from the struggle, not sure which way to go and how to take it forward. And it's because we're dealing with a situation where the problems are much, much bigger that can be dealt with by a parliamentary election. I mean, if it's evident if they had that much resistance to the possibility of a Corbyn government, then if there were a Corbyn government, they would have huge resources, military, police, sabotage, all kinds of subterfuge, economic sabotage and so on, to resist any opportunity on the part of a government that came to power with even the modest program that Corbyn was putting forward to the country. And so we have some activists trying to keep the movement alive, and hundreds of thousands of disillusioned activists who are waiting to see a new opening. An explosion, this is the point about Iskra, a spark amongst the youth could open up a whole new movement, and it could happen any time. A party is needed, a new party is needed, but the mass of the population are not yet ready to construct one. And they'll have to go through a process of action and activity and learning in order to get, I mean, like Larry was saying, local issues, local events, youth getting involved in trade unions before the conclusion is drawn of the need for the construction of a new party. There is a conservatism amongst some of the more advanced layers of the movement as well. Some clinging on to the Labour Party, some just clinging on to hope, not sure what the way forward is. Now, something could happen any time to bring about a new change in the situation, a new movement like Black Lives Matter coming out of nowhere, which would change the atmosphere. The ruling class, of course, will use all kinds of arguments and subterfuge to derail a new movement that is headed for a more equal society. I wonder, I pose this as a question, will part of the ruling class create another argument about membership of the EU to create a nationalist distraction? And connected with that, it's another question, which I don't know the answer, but Roger mentioned the Protestant community in Northern Ireland somehow moving towards a united Ireland. I can see, again, issues like that being used as a distraction by the far right to create, you know, this is the breakup of the UK and to create all kinds of nationalist distractions. Of course, once we have a workers' party that knows where it's going, that knows the spirit of internationalism, that knows how to build links with comrades in France and Germany and Ireland and so on, then those kind of issues can be quashed more effectively. But with the situation, the impasse that we have at the moment, those sort of dangerous nationalist subterfuge tricks by the ruling class are still likely to block our way some of the time. That's it, Pam. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks for sticking to your 5 minutes. Excellent. Unfortunately, I noticed we have lost a couple of speakers. I think maybe in the future, if people need to leave, if they could put a message in the chat to ask to come into the discussion early, I'll bring them in. So unfortunately, we've lost those 2 contributions this time. But I'm not actually, I know, Matt, you've had your hand up, but I'm going to bring John and Dominic in next because they haven't spoken yet. So I hope you're all right with that.
Hi, Dominic. I just wanted to follow on Ed's thing a little bit. I think really Roger's summary of it, to my mind, is encapsulated in the fact that Corbyn's programme was basically the same sort of programme the Labour was putting forward in the 1960s. Some nationalisation, some reforms and so on. And I think it's also an indication of how far politics have moved to the right in this country. That was viewed with horror by the capitalists. Yet Harold Macmillan, who was a Tory Prime Minister in the late 50s, early 60s, when it came to Thatcher privatising the industries that were nationalised, was totally opposed to it. So you had a Tory Prime Minister of that era supporting restricted nationalisation of essential services. And now you've got the sort of Tories who are rampant sort of free marketers. You've got, what's his name, Boris Johnson, coming out last week about more or less with Selsdon Man, which was a programme that Heath came out with in the early 70s, of basically laying ducks to the wall, had to retreat on that a few years later when it came about that they had to nationalise Rolls-Royce to keep it going. Now you've got him, Johnson doing the same with regard to, laying ducks to the wall. And a week later, they're talking of subsidies for industry. But I also wanted to touch on some other things about the Parliamentary Labour Party and that sort of setup, because I think that it seems to me anyway, that the Parliamentary Labour Party are under the illusion that Starmer can pull Blair's victory in 1997 out of the hat for Labour. I mean, it's absolutely crazy. The world has moved on. Blair was a capitalist candidate in 1997 because the Tories were totally unelected, and he'd solidly indicated that with New Labour, that he was not going to take on the capitalists, he'd look after their interests and so on, and that was the programme. And Blair stayed in office till 2017 when he resigned. 2007, sorry, when he resigned, just before the crash. Presumably he jumped ship before it happened. But the major event that's taken part as far as the Labour Party is concerned was the election of Corbyn as leader in 2015. And we saw what I was thought would be the normal process, and it was the normal process, that when there's a crisis and when there's hope for a change of the conditions of the working class start to move towards the traditional organisations. They move towards the Labour Party, they move towards the trade unions. And I think that the importance of socialists at the present time, to my mind anyway, is to be in the Labour Party, in the trade unions, not to support right-wing ideas, but to put forward socialist ideas that will get an echo. And I think we might see an upsurge in Labour Party membership, because I think Starmer hasn't got the same sort of roots, hasn't got the potential that Blair had. His only offer at conference, as Roger said, was some money for mental health. And when it came to a question of the minimum wage, he totally blocked any support for a £15 minimum wage and kept to the, was it 2016? £6 an hour. So £10 an hour, I beg your pardon. So those are a few things I thought I'd stick in there. Oh,
Thanks, Dominic.
Cheers.
Right. Thank you. Right, we've still got Matt spinning once. Is there anybody else that wants to say anything very quickly before I give Matt a couple of minutes? Then I'll ask Roger to sum up. No? Matt, can you do it in 2 or 3 minutes?
Yeah. I just think I try and develop some of the points that have been made just recently, which is obviously the whole question of social democracy and reformism. And I mean, I think the thing is that it was quite clear. The problem is that in terms of the Corbyn movement, it's quite clear that if Corbyn got to government, he would have conceded virtually everything. I mean, he was prepared to concede most things even before he got into government. And what would happen would have been fairly chaotic, and I think quite demoralising that we'd have elected a government, which would then capitulate to the capitalists, as we've seen elsewhere. I mean, the nature of the politics and so on. If you look at the whole behaviour, I mean, the right wing in the Labour Party and social democracy quite clearly backed by the ruling class, and therefore the left was not prepared to run the challenge, a serious challenge to these people, which would have obviously involved a split. And instead, I mean, the thing is, I think that the important thing is the crisis of the Labour Party becomes to such a point that you see the left for the very first time in its history. I mean, the Labour Party has always been run by the right wing. That the left actually takes office on the basis of an upsurge of people looking for some way to fight against austerity and the Tories. Now, most of these people who joined were not members of the Labour Party, or were particularly, loyal to the Labour Party at all. They joined because they saw an opportunity to fight. And I think that really you're looking at this problem that you've got then that comes up against the tradition of the left, the Labour Party, which sees party unity and so on as being critical, and therefore a concession, even within the Labour Party, to the right wing and the ruling class behind that right wing. And I think that now you what you need, or what we see, is the requirement for a break from that, which is why the likes of Jeremy Corbyn and so forth are not actually wanting to lead anything against Starmer, really, in any serious way. And you can see this also with the silence of the Socialist Campaign Group and so on. I think the other key question here also is the role of the union bureaucracy. Now, the union bureaucracy has been used all over the world, and you can see it very clearly if you see as a means of control of the working class and the upsurge of the working class. And you can see it in every country that layer is being consciously used by the ruling class as a means of controlling the fight of the workers and of imposing things upon the workers. And it's what's happening, of course, is it's wearing down that layer of that level of support for the current union structures, and therefore any move by the working class in order to organise itself to fight the capitalists will go through the unions and actually start to break up some of the structures of the unions as well. And I think this is critical. We have to say, look, these organisations are thoroughly, as the Labour Party is thoroughly integrated into the mechanisms of control by the ruling class, as are the unions. And the question is, once you come into serious conflict between the working class and the ruling class, that goes through politically, has to go through politically in terms of actually, the structures of social democracy, which we can see disintegrating all over, and also the structures and organisations of the unions as well. And so I think a very deep layer of questioning towards the any form of bureaucracy, whoever that is, And also, of course, the requirement for the self-organisation of workers in the workplace and as wider networks, independent of that bureaucracy and acting in its own interests and seeing it have very distinct interests from the bureaucracy. So we can see, the union bureaucracy is quite separate now. I mean, in this country, it's got to the point where you've got a situation where the union bureaucracy actually recruits from the universities.
Matt, can I ask you to sort of start winding up? So I just want to give Roger a chance.
Fine, that's it.
To interrupt me. I know what you say is really valuable, but we're trying to finish for 6. I do want to give Roger a chance to respond thoroughly. Well, thank you for your remarks. Right, Roger, you want to sum up now?
Well, I'm not going to try and answer all the points that were made. A very, very interesting discussion, but obviously only the beginning. And, we have plenty of opportunity to take up these issues further. But I do think, first of all, let's remember that the point of these discussions is when we're discussing perspectives, of course, we're not clairvoyant, but at the same time, we're not just reporting eclectically on the snapshot position that exists now. We're using our Marxist understanding and our experience to try to draw some perspectives, some lines of how things will develop. First of all, I mean, I must say, I do not agree with I cannot even conceive of the use of the word stability in relation to the perspectives for Britain or the world today. It is the most disturbed, violent, chaotic and unstable situation that I think the world has seen for many, many decades. Anyway, put it that way. It's I cannot see any possibility. The fact that Johnson blusters, as he blusters all the time, he improvises, he makes it up as he goes along. And if he starts saying, "Oh, I'll be in power for another 10 years," I mean, we cannot take that seriously. That's we don't base our perspectives on what Johnson says, but about the actual instability and crisis in society itself. Now, it's true. I'm not saying that the Tories are going to be defeated or that they won't retain power. I doubt if Johnson will, because I think there's so many factions and splits and divides within the ruling class and within the Tory party that I think it's very unlikely that he can ride the storm. I'm not even sure that he wants to be honest. He's on record as having said he can make a lot more money in other ways. But but the Tories might remain in power, one or another. It might be that the question that comrades have raised about it moving towards Bonapartist solution, that's also very clear. They might, I think, they could easily not only guarantee themselves to stay in a kind of semi-parliamentary democracy. I mean, I mentioned some of the issues, and so that has come up in the discussion too, about the ways that actually this government is moving in a way that Thatcher never did, or even Cameron or May, towards semi-dictatorial solution, towards a move away from what's been accepted so far as the norms and the this kind of sacred tenets of a parliamentary democracy. It may stay in power, but instability is the watchword. It won't only be in Parliament. There'll be so many crises in society, and I also, would say that moving on to I'm trying to get some order into my notes. The question of the youth again, for instance, it's incredibly significant, this movement to the left among the youth. It's something which, as I say, the most establishment-based institutions in British society have noted it and have warned against anybody underplaying the significance of this movement to the left among youth. It's there and it will continue. And even Starmer's concession of mental instability among youth, he knows very well what the basis of that instability is, that the youth actually have no kind of future to look forward to, even if we discount the question of environmental dangers and all the rest of it. In capitalist society, you can offer them nothing. Can't offer them an education, can't offer them a decent living standards or a decent creative outlet for their energies, all the rest of it. And therefore, that is going to be a huge problem. Now, the question is, of course, we know that they're not organised, but they were organised. They were mobilised behind Corbyn only a couple of years ago. And they were, well, in fact, in the 2019 election, they were, as I say, they had a 43% lead supporting Corbyn over the Tories or any other party. It was a huge, the youth were almost unanimous in their support for some kind of left, for what they've called socialism. 70% among the youth say in opinion polls that they support socialism. I know they don't know what it means, but it's of a huge significance that they, in other words, they've rejected any kind of faith in capitalism, and they want a new society. Now, I know they're not organised yet, so they were, and they will be. And as I say, I'm not presenting a picture that the revolution is already accomplished. I don't know whether the revolution will succeed or not. But it's our responsibility to lay stress on what is positive and what may be possible, and to build on that, and to not simply to present a kind of balance sheet of where we in a lack of a perspective of where we're going. I'm sorry that I'm finding it difficult to express myself on this question, but I think it's absolutely essential that we base ourselves on not just on a snapshot of the situation that exists now, but we recognise the realities of now and build on that. Some other questions. I mean, there was a lot about the Labour Party, about Corbyn, and about Starmer. I deliberately didn't say much on that because there is a lot that I've said recently in other forums about that, and I don't want to repeat that. And that's actually not the focus of the discussion tonight. But I do think we have to understand, again, don't just take a snapshot. What we've seen in the Labour Party is, over the last 5 years, absolute convulsions, huge transformation of the balance of forces, with hundreds of thousands of people mobilized by the hope of some kind of left move on the part of the Labour Party. We saw that. And of course, there's now a situation of demoralization, of despair. It's falling away. But again, as I say, we don't just take a snapshot of the situation now. We look at the trends, we look at the movements and the perspectives. And the perspectives are that the youth are looking for a political solution. And it's also the case that, I mean, what we see in the Labour Party at the moment, of course, the split that's developing, the right wing are pursuing the split absolutely ferociously and determinedly and resolutely, and they're pursuing it right to the end. And the left has been taken unawares, and it's in confusion at the moment. But I think those of us, there are some comrades who, along with me, have been attending meetings, maybe 2 or 3 meetings a week, sometimes more than that, of comrades who are on the left of the Labour Party or who have left the Labour Party in despair, all the rest of it. And I think we can sense that even in the last few weeks, even since the Labour Party conference, there is a kind of hardening of the mood and a kind of resolve that the left has to take some kind of initiative. Now, what kind of initiative? I think most people realise that simply saying we'll stay in the Labour Party and our time will come again is no way to hold 90 or 99% of the activists of the Corbyn era. And in fact, that it's quite clear that in no way will the right wing ever allow even another Corbyn to take the leadership. Starmer and Evans will prefer to destroy the Labour Party, and they're in the process of doing that rather than to allow that kind of possibility. But therefore, you know, it's also, there are people who are saying, well, to hell with it, we'll form a new party. But of course, we already have a dozen, probably more than a dozen left parties, all of a few hundred people, all of them suffering from the delusion that they can become a mass party. The question is that we have to have a halfway house at the moment until the dust settles, or perhaps that's the wrong way to put it, because as I say, the dust is never going to settle. It's going to be more and more dusty. But until there seems to be some clear consensus of which way to go, and until there's some kind of mass base, then the thing to do is to have some kind of interim, transitional holding operation, which would be an organisation of people who are still in the Labour Party, those of them who are still left, and those who are outside that want to mobilise and organise, in order to hold some kind of holding operation to keep the left, or what is still active, to keep them together and to give them a springboard to once again go to the huge constituency for the left that exists, particularly among the youth, but also in society in general. Now, the key to that, especially, is the unions, and we're seeing, despite the fact, you know, David Lowe always caricatured the TUC as a cart horse, which moves very slowly, and it's even the cart horse of Labour now. We're beginning to see some cracks to if you like, to mix the metaphors, some cracks in the ice, that something is beginning to move. The Bakers Union, very significant that the Bakers Union voted during the Labour Party conference to disaffiliate from the Labour Party. The RMT already long ago, the FBU already long ago, but then it rejoined, but again, it's very much on the cards that it may also disaffiliate again. Unite, huge transformation that is taking place in Unite. Where that will end, it's not clear yet. But the possibility of a new trade union-based left party is by no means excluded. Okay, and I think that's the way to go. I mean, there are so many other points that were raised that I would like to deal with, but we will have plenty of opportunity to discuss them in future meetings. Thanks very much, comrades, for a very, very stimulating discussion.
Well, thanks very much, Roger, and thanks everybody for making a contribution. That we've had an excellent discussion today. From lots of people have contributed. I think it's been a really good meeting as usual. So I think that's the end of the discussion. I don't know if Roger wants to come back and say something about the next meeting.
Well, we're pursuing some various options, but I'd like to say something anyway, that don't leave it to us. Any comrades here who would like to offer to lead off a discussion, please feel free. In fact, don't just feel free, I'd urge you to volunteer. So if so, perhaps you could, well, you could email me, or you could even say on the spot now if you're willing to offer your services.
You've set the bar very high today, though, Roger.
Well, I don't know about that.
Okay, there doesn't seem to be any immediate offers, so we'll
You will be. We'll of course, through watch your emails. You will get notice of meetings. We're meeting every week, and we are. I'm astounded myself at how successful Win has been in getting on the spot eyewitness frontline reports from comrades from around the world, and a real democratic forum and real democratic discussion of all the issues that these throw up. So,
Steve Zeltzer, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, maybe you could have it. We could have a forum on the rise of fascism.
Yes.
around the world. That would be very useful. You know, how fascist forces are growing politically and how they're organizing internationally. I think that would be a very useful discussion, you know, as the
Absolutely.
situation in Australia, Italy, the United States, and in other countries.
I absolutely agree with you, Steve. That was actually on our plan, and the comrade who had volunteered to lead off on it simply said that he wasn't quite ready and he needs a couple of weeks. But that definitely will be on our agenda, and
Okay,
of course
good.
we welcome your contribution to that discussion.
Okay. That's it. Okay. Well, I think that's it for this week. I'll close the meeting. Thank you all for your attendance. Hope to see you all next week.
Thanks,
Take care,
comrade.
guys. All the best.
Bye. 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 Bye.
Bye.